The sun bore down mercilessly upon the frontier town, casting long shadows across the wooden buildings and stirring up dust with every footfall. The air itself seemed heavy, as though the world was holding its breath. A crowd had gathered in. The square, farmers with sun-cracked hands, merchants with calculating eyes, and restless drifters drawn by curiosity. At the center of it all stood a makeshift platform of rough planks, the auction block, raised just high enough for everyone to see the figure standing upon it. She was alone. The Comanche woman's wrists were bound in front of her, though. The ropes seemed more symbolic than necessary. There was no fear in her bearing. Her dark eyes scanned the faces around her, sharp and unyielding, meeting every stare with the pride of her people. She stood tall, her chin lifted, her posture unwavering, as though daring the crowd to reduce her to an object. The ragged fringes of her buckskin dress hung against the grime of the block, yet there was nothing ragged about her spirit. The auctioneer, a red-faced man with a booming voice, paced back and forth, his hat tilted low against the sun. "Ladies and gentlemen," he bellowed, gesturing toward her with a flourish, "here stands a fine specimen, strong, young, and fit for work or home. A rare chance. Who will open the bidding?" A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some men leaned forward, their eyes narrowing with a mix of curiosity and disdain. Others looked away, shaking their heads, muttering under their breath. "She's wild," one man spat into the dirt. "Nothing but trouble," another scoffed. "Wouldn't take her if she was free," someone else sneered, drawing a coarse laugh. The woman did not flinch. Their words, though cruel, seemed to bounce off the armor of her silence. She was a warrior's daughter, perhaps even a warrior herself, and humiliation was not foreign to her. But standing alone, stripped of her freedom, her heart tightened like a clenched fist. The auctioneer clapped his hands, straining to rouse enthusiasm. "Come now, who will give me $20? $20 for a strong pair of hands? She'll fetch water, tend stock, work your homestead, stronger than most men's wives." He chuckled, though the sound rang hollow in the still air. Still, no hand went up. In the back, a few men whispered about the risks. "Her kin will come for her," one said, his voice low. "Comanche don't forget." Another nodded, eyes darting nervously toward the open plains beyond the town. Fear sat in their hearts more firmly than any thought of profit. The woman's gaze cut through the murmuring crowd. Each set of eyes she met flickered away, as if the fire in her soul was too much to endure. They had expected brokenness, tears, perhaps pleading. Instead, they found defiance, an ember of dignity that refused to die, even in chains. The auctioneer's face tightened with irritation. Sweat dripped down his temple as he raised his arms again. $15 then. Who will give 15? 10. 10 then. His voice carried desperation now. Surely $10 ain't too much for a woman with spirit. A hush settled. No one moved. No one offered even a token bid. The Comanche woman closed her eyes briefly. In that moment, she thought of her people, the wild freedom of the plains, the laughter of the campfires, the songs that told of ancestors and battles won. She imagined the wind on her face, her horse beneath her, the vast sky stretching endlessly. To stand here, treated as less than human, was a cruelty she would not forget. Yet she refused to let them see weakness. She opened her eyes again, steady and unbroken, her gaze like an arrow loosed into the crowd. Children peered out from behind their mothers' skirts, sensing the tension though they could not grasp its meaning. Dogs barked at the edges of the square, restless from the energy pressing down on the scene. Somewhere a church bell tolled noon, but even its chime seemed to falter in the heavy air. The auctioneer stomped his boot against the planks in frustration. "Is there no man among you with sense? No man with the courage to take her on?" His words echoed, challenging the crowd, but the silence that followed was louder still. And there she remained, alone upon the block, bound by ropes but standing. "Freer in spirit than any soul below," the people muttered. The dust swirled. And in that charged stillness, the story of her fate waited to be written, not by the jeers of the crowd, nor by the gavel of the auctioneer, but by the hand of someone yet unseen. The auctioneer's words hung in the air, unanswered. The square remained still, save for the restless shuffle of boots and the creak of wagon wheels in the distance. The Comanche woman stood tall against the weight of silence, the late summer sun gleaming against her dark hair, catching the sharp planes of her face. She was a figure carved in defiance, and that alone unsettled many of the onlookers. The crowd had come expecting entertainment. Auctions were a spectacle in this frontier town, a chance to gossip, to laugh, to see the misfortune of others paraded before them. Yet this one was different. This woman was not broken. Her silence was not submission but resistance, and it made every man in the square suddenly aware of his own cowardice. "Fools," muttered the auctioneer under his breath, though his forced smile never faltered. He tried again, raising his arms as though to part the crowd itself. "A fine woman here, worth more than any of you can reckon. Look at her strength. Look at the fire in her eyes. That's worth something, ain't it?" But his voice grated against the crowd's unease. Men avoided her gaze, looking instead at their boots or spitting into the dust. Their silence was not indifference, it was fear. One farmer, a heavy-set man with calloused hands, whispered harshly to his neighbor, "Mark me, Tom, if you take her home, she'll slit your throat while you sleep." The other gave a nervous laugh. "Ain't worth the risk. Her kin'll come howling down on us before the week's out. You want Comanche arrows in your barn door?" "No man needs that trouble," added a third, shaking his head firmly. "She ain't a prize, she's a curse." The word spread like wildfire, murmurs swelling until the square was thick with whispered judgments. Some spoke of danger, others spoke of shame. Many did not even try to hide their disdain. "She looks at us like we're the animals," sneered a drunk leaning against the hitching post. His words slurred, but the malice in his eyes was sharp. "Let her rot. Best place for her. A few." Women in the crowd tugged their children closer, as though the sight of the Comanche woman's unbroken spirit might infect them with rebellion. Their lips pursed, their eyes narrowed, but beneath their disapproval lay something else. Perhaps envy of her defiance, perhaps pity they dared not voice. Through it all, she remained unflinching. Bound wrists, dust on her skin, strangers' laughter, all of it meant nothing compared to what she had already endured. Her people had faced fire, bullets, betrayal, and yet they still roamed the plains. If this town thought to break her with silence, they underestimated the strength of her bloodline. The auctioneer, growing desperate, jabbed a finger toward her as though she were livestock. "You'll not find finer stock for labor. She'll haul, she'll tend, she'll keep your place in order. What's wrong with you men? Afraid of a slip of a girl?" The insult landed not on her, but on the crowd itself. A ripple of anger moved through them, pride stung by the suggestion of cowardice. Still, no hands rose. It was not the woman's strength that kept them at bay, but the reflection of their own weakness in her gaze. Each man who met her eyes felt it, like a mirror held too close, exposing what they lacked. Bravery, integrity, honor. Children fidgeted restlessly, sensing the tension. One boy, no older than 10, tugged on his father's sleeve. "Pa, why, won't anyone take her?" he asked innocently. The man silenced him with a sharp glare, dragging him back into the crowd. A gust of wind kicked up, swirling dust across the square. The woman turned her face slightly, but her eyes remained fixed, forward. She would not look away. If she must be displayed like a possession, then she would at least remind them she was human, flesh, blood, and unbroken spirit. The auctioneer's voice cracked now, his bravado slipping. $10, 5 even, $5. A man could spend more at the saloon in a night. Come on, gentlemen, who'll have her? But the square answered with silence. The Comanche woman let her eyes sweep over them one final time. Not one among them met her gaze. They had reduced her to an object, and yet none had the courage to claim that object, not out of pity, nor pride, nor profit. The hypocrisy of it pressed upon the air like a storm waiting to break, and so she stood alone still, her dignity intact, her fate uncertain, while the crowd, louder in its silence than in any shout, waited for someone else to make the choice they would not. On the edge of the crowd, leaning against the shadowed side of the mercantile, stood a man few ever noticed. He was not tall enough to command attention, nor loud enough to claim space. His hat brim was pulled low, shading his face from the harsh afternoon sun. Dust clung to his boots, and his clothes bore the wear of honest labor, patched denim, a faded work shirt, the faint smell of horse and earth. He was known in town simply as the Quiet Rancher. He seldom came into the settlement, except when supplies demanded it, flour, salt, feed. He kept to himself, living alone on the stretch of land his father had carved from the wilderness decades before. Some said he preferred cattle to men, and perhaps that was true. Cattle didn't judge. Cattle didn't gossip. Cattle didn't ask about a past he never cared to share. Yet today he found himself drawn into the square, standing among men he did not care to stand beside. And as the auctioneer's shouts rang hollow, as the crowd's silence grew heavier, his eyes remained fixed on the woman upon the block. She was unlike anyone he had ever seen. Not because she was Comanche. He had crossed paths with warriors before, seen them ride swift and fierce across the plains, but because of the way she stood. There was no collapse in her shoulders, no downward cast of her gaze. Even bound, she was freer than most of the men sneering at her. The rancher saw it in her posture, in the fire that burned behind her eyes. She had not yielded. Not even here, where all the world seemed determined to humiliate her. And something inside him stirred. He remembered loss. Memories buried so deep he rarely let them surface. A grave too small on his homestead. A ring tucked away in a drawer he never opened. A voice that had once filled his home with laughter but had long since been swallowed by silence. Loneliness had carved him into stone, but now, watching her, he felt something crack within him. She reminded him of the way he used to be, proud, unbending, unwilling to bow to life's cruelties. He saw in her the strength he had once tried to carry before grief had hollowed him out. The crowd muttered its disdain, but he listened past their words. He heard instead the steady beat of his own heart, louder than the auctioneer's calls. He felt the injustice of it, the woman treated as less than human, the town too afraid to claim responsibility for her fate. The longer he watched, the more a weight pressed on his chest, demanding he act. But he was a quiet man, and quiet men did not act rashly. His hands rested against the rough wood of the building behind him, fingers curling and uncurling. He studied her. How she held her chin high, how she refused to give the crowd the satisfaction of fear. He thought of how it must feel to stand alone in front of strangers who would rather see you broken. He thought of his own years spent in silence, of how solitude could cut deeper than any knife. She deserved more than this, he realized. More than their ridicule, more than their silence. But to step forward would mean becoming a target himself. He could already hear the laughter, the whispers, the gossip that would follow him if he raised his hand. The quiet rancher, buying himself a Comanche bride, the man too strange, too lonely, too desperate. They would laugh in saloons and at supper tables. They would brand him with her fate, and yet he could not look away. The auctioneer barked again, voice hoarse now, his words half a plea. "Someone! Anyone! Who will make the first bid?" The woman's eyes swept over the crowd, landing for the briefest moment on the rancher in the shadows. He felt it like a spark, sharp, sudden, undeniable. In that gaze was not plea nor gratitude. It was challenge. She dared him as she dared every man present to see her not as an object, but as a person. The rancher swallowed hard, his throat dry. His heart thudded against his ribs, louder now, insistent. He shifted his weight, pulling his hat lower to hide the turmoil etched on his face. He wanted to remain unseen, to stay part of the silence. Yet something in him, some buried ember of courage, began to smolder. For perhaps the first time in years, the quiet rancher felt alive. The auctioneer's voice cracked as he shouted over the heavy silence of the square. His hat brim quivered with the jerky motion of his hand as he gestured toward the lone figure on the block. $5! Who'll start at 5? He cried, desperation seeping into every syllable. His tone no longer carried the boastful confidence of a man in control. It rang instead like a gambler on his last coin. But the crowd held firm in its silence. Some muttered excuses to themselves. Too risky, not worth it, bad luck. Others shifted uncomfortably, as if the very air pressed upon them. A few chuckled, cruelly, enjoying the humiliation of both the woman on the block and the red-faced auctioneer. The Comanche woman's gaze swept over them again, defiant as ever. Her chin lifted just slightly higher, as if daring them to meet her eyes. Most didn't. Those who did looked away quickly, their own cowardice reflected too clearly in her unflinching stare. The auctioneer's face reddened deeper. He slammed, his palm against the wooden rail of the platform, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "By thunder, are you all cowards? She ain't gonna bite. She's bound tighter than a calf for branding. $5. 4. Hell, I'll take 3. Don't let her stand here like a waste of good money." His voice broke on the last words. The crowd shifted uneasily. On the edge of the square, the quiet rancher straightened from the wall where he leaned. His chest rose with a slow, deep breath. His hand moved to the brim of his hat, pressing it lower as though it might shield him from the storm that would surely follow. He knew what would happen if he spoke. He knew the whispers, the laughter, the judgment would be his to bear. And still, he looked at her. The woman stood unmoving, proud as an oak against the cutting wind. She did not look beaten. She looked eternal. And in that moment, the rancher realized something. If he did nothing, if he let her be dismissed like an unwanted stray, the image of her proud defiance would haunt him forever. The auctioneer raised the gavel in a trembling hand. "Last call, gentlemen. If no one bids, she'll be carted off. Might end up in worse hands than yours. Is that what you want?" The murmurs rose, uneasy and hollow. A few men chuckled, a few spat, but still no one stepped forward. The rancher's hand twitched at his side. His jaw tightened. His heart pounded in his ears. The gavel lifted higher. The woman's eyes swept across the crowd one last time, pausing just for a breath on the shadowed figure at the edge. Her gaze pierced through the dust and distance, sharp as a knife. And the quiet rancher, feeling that gaze pin him in place, knew he could not remain silent. He lifted his hand. The motion was small, but in the stillness of the square, it was like thunder rolling over the plains. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Heads snapped toward him. The auctioneer froze, mid-swing, gavel trembling in the air. All eyes fell on the man who had raised his hand. The quiet rancher stood straighter now, though his voice when it came was calm, low, and steady. $5. The words were simple, but they carried like a rifle shot. The murmurs swelled into disbelief. "Him?" someone whispered. "The quiet one?" Another scoffed. "Lord above, he's lost his senses." The auctioneer blinked, mouth working soundlessly, before he managed a stammered reply. $5? We have $5. Do I hear 6? But no one answered. The crowd was too stunned, too scandalized. Some shook their heads. Others sneered. A few laughed under their breath, their derision sharp as whips. The woman did not look away. Her eyes remained locked on the man who had spoken, searching, measuring. She gave no sign of gratitude, no softening of her proud features. But in her gaze there was acknowledgment. He had acted when none else had. The auctioneer's gavel came down with a crack. "Sold! Sold for $5 to the rancher!" The square erupted in whispers and laughter. The rancher heard every word as he stepped forward, but he kept his head steady, his shoulders square. His heart still hammered in his chest, but his voice had not faltered, and that somehow gave him strength. He walked toward the block, each step a quiet defiance of the crowd's mockery. Dust swirled around his boots, sunlight beating down as if to spotlight the choice he had made. And as he reached the platform, the woman's eyes never left his, unblinking, unyielding. He had claimed her fate, but whether he was her captor or her savior remained a question yet to be answered. The crowd parted as the rancher stepped forward, their whispers snapping at his heels like snapping dogs. He could feel every eye on him, mocking, suspicious, some even pitying, but he didn't falter. His boots struck the boards of the platform, with a steady rhythm, the sound echoing in the tense air. The auctioneer, still flushed from embarrassment, forced a grin wide across his face. "Well, there you have it, folks. Sold fair and square." His voice wavered, but relief tinged his tone. At least the sale was made, and the cursed business concluded. He gestured hastily for the woman to step down from the block, but she did not move. Bound though her wrists were, the Comanche woman stood as firmly as before, her feet planted like roots in the earth. Her eyes did not shift to the ground in submission. Instead, they locked onto the rancher, piercing and unwavering. The rancher paused, hat brim shading his eyes. He could feel her defiance like heat radiating in the space between them. She wasn't cowed, wasn't grateful, wasn't relieved. To her, this was no rescue. To her, he was just another captor. The murmurs from the crowd thickened. "She ain't gonna follow him?" someone muttered. "Better watch his throat at night," another chuckled. "Quiet fool's bought himself trouble he won't crawl out of," a third sneered. The rancher ignored them. His gaze never left hers, though beneath the calm of his face, he felt the storm of what lay ahead. He had made his choice in a moment of impulse, or maybe something deeper, some voice in his bones. But now he had to stand by it. Slowly he lifted his hand toward her, not to grab or drag, but to offer. The gesture was simple, almost awkward, but it carried the weight of his intent. He would not force her. The woman's eyes narrowed. Her lips parted, not in words but in the smallest curl of disdain. She did not take his hand. Instead, she stepped down from the block herself, the wooden boards groaning beneath her deliberate movement. Her shoulders squared, her back straight, every motion declaring that though her fate had been sold, her will had not. When her boots struck the dirt of the square, she stood before him like a flame, refusing to be snuffed. Bound, yes. Sold, yes. But defeated, never. The rancher lowered his hand, accepting her choice. He did not try again. Instead, he stepped aside, allowing her to walk of her own accord. She moved past him with her chin high, her gaze sweeping once more across the gawking townsfolk. If any had expected her to shrink, they were disappointed. Her pride, sharper than steel, cut through their laughter. Behind them, the auctioneer wiped his brow, muttering something about finally done with it before calling for the next item. The crowd's attention lingered, though. They couldn't peel their eyes away from the strange sight. The quiet rancher and the unbroken Comanche woman walking side by side, neither touching, neither yielding. A drunk near the saloon jeered loudly, slurring his words. "She'll gut you before the week's out, rancher!" His companions roared with laughter. The rancher didn't glance their way. He kept his head forward, his stride even, his silence louder than any retort. The woman beside him, though shackled, carried herself with the dignity of a queen. Their unlikely pairing was not a scene of ownership, but of two forces colliding, neither willing to bend. At the edge of the square, he untied the reins of his horse. It stamped the ground impatiently, sensing the tension. He looked to her then, his expression unreadable. Without words, he motioned toward the horse. Her dark eyes flicked to the animal, then back to him. For a heartbeat, she considered refusing, considered walking until her feet bled, if only to deny him the satisfaction of her compliance. But her pride was not foolishness. She swung into the saddle with fluid grace, her bound hands steadying against the pommel. She sat tall, higher now than the crowd, her gaze sweeping over them like a hawk surveying prey. The rancher mounted behind her, careful to keep a respectful distance, his hands guiding the reins with practiced ease. They did not speak. The silence between them was taut, thick with mistrust. As the horse carried them out of the square, the townsfolk's laughter and whispers faded behind them, replaced by the steady rhythm of hooves striking hard-packed earth. Neither looked back. The rancher knew this was only the beginning, that her defiance would test him every step of the way, that she would not accept her place as easily as the crowd assumed, and the woman knew one thing with equal certainty. Though her fate had been claimed, her spirit remained her own. Theirs would not be the story of master and possession. It would be the clash of two unyielding wills set against the vast and unforgiving land. The town's voices faded behind them, swallowed by the rhythm of hooves striking hard-packed dirt. Dust rose in little clouds with each step, drifting lazily, in the heat of the afternoon sun. The rancher's horse, sturdy and well-worn from years of labor, carried its two riders steadily, though the tension upon its back was unlike any it had ever borne. The rancher sat tall, reins loose in his calloused hands, his eyes fixed on the road stretching beyond the town. He said nothing, his silence as much a shield as it was a habit. But his senses were sharp. He could feel the rigid set of her shoulders in front of him, the stiffness in her back, the deliberate way she kept herself as far forward in the saddle as her bound hands allowed. She wanted no closeness. The Comanche woman kept her head high, the wind tugging strands of her dark hair free. She did not glance at him, not once, though she could sense his presence behind her, steady as the sun overhead. Her thoughts were not of him, but of escape. Always escape. Each line of fence they passed, each dry gully or thicket along the road, she studied with a hunter's eye. Even bound, she was measuring distances, weighing possibilities. The town had humiliated her, but out here, under the open sky, her spirit surged back to life. This land was still her land, no matter how the settlers plowed or fenced it. Somewhere, beyond the horizon, her people still roamed free. The silence between them stretched. The rancher cleared his throat once, as though to speak, but no words came. He had never been a man of many words. In truth, he doubted she would hear them if he tried. Words would mean nothing to a woman who had just been bartered like cattle. So he held his tongue, guiding the horse instead toward the open plains. Hours passed. The road grew lonelier with each mile, the sound of the town replaced by the cries of meadowlarks and the whisper of tall grass swaying in the dry breeze. Still neither spoke. The silence was not comfortable. It was thick, heavy with mistrust, but neither attempted to break it. At a narrow creek, the rancher pulled the reins and the horse slowed to a halt. The animal lowered its head to drink, snorting softly. The Rancher dismounted first, boots crunching in the dry soil. He glanced up at the woman, then extended a hand, not to pull her down, but to offer support if she chose. She did not take it. Instead, she swung down on her own, landing lightly on her feet despite her bound wrists. She stepped away from him, her eyes sharp, scanning the creek and the tree line beyond, as if calculating how far she could run before he caught her. The rancher didn't chase her gaze. He crouched by the water, splashing it over his face, letting the coolness cut through the day's heat. Then, without looking at her, he filled a small tin cup and set it on the ground, just within reach. He did not force it into her hands. He simply left it there and stepped back. For a long moment, she didn't move. She stared at the cup as though it were a trick. Her pride warred with the dryness in her throat. At last, she knelt and lifted it, sipping carefully, never turning her back to him. The water soothed her, though her eyes remained wary, never leaving his figure. The rancher said nothing. He refilled the cup for himself and drank, then poured some over his horse's neck. The silence stretched again, but there was no mockery in it, no jeering crowd, only the wind and the sound of running water. When they mounted again, the distance between them was the same as before, rigid, careful, but a faint shift lingered. She had taken the water he offered, though on her own terms. He had given it without demand. The sun dipped lower in the sky as they rode on, the shadows lengthening across the open land. The town was far behind them now, nothing but a smudge in memory. Before them lay miles of plains, the horizon endless, uncertain. The rancher guided the horse onward, his mind heavy with unspoken thoughts. He knew this journey would not be simple. She was not a possession, not a docile prize to be tamed. She was a storm, fierce and unyielding. And though he had claimed her fate in the town square, he understood now that her spirit was hers alone. The Comanche woman sat tall before him, silent but proud, her eyes fixed on the horizon. She did not know where this road would lead, or what his intentions truly were. But one truth burned steady in her chest. Whatever lay ahead, she would not bow. The prairie stretched endless before them, painted in the dim light of twilight. The quiet rhythm of the horse's hooves carried them further from the town, but closer to the weight the rancher had carried for years. Each mile seemed to draw his thoughts inward, to the ghosts that haunted him. The Comanche woman rode in silence, her back stiff, her head turned away. She had not asked a single question, nor spoken a word since the auction block. Her silence suited him in a way, yet it also pressed against his chest like a stone. He had chosen her fate in front of everyone. Yet the truth was he had been answering the call of something older, something deeper. The rancher had lived his life in solitude. A modest ranch, a handful of cattle, a quiet existence on the edge of the frontier. That was all the world knew of him. But behind that quiet exterior lay a past that the town never saw. He had once ridden with others, men younger, brash, and quick with their guns. Years ago, when the frontier was wilder, he had been one of them, a drifter, a hand hired for dangerous work. His hands were calloused from ranching now, but they had once been calloused from the reins of horses ridden fast into raids, into conflicts, where dust and blood mixed under the hot sun. It was during those years he first crossed paths with the Comanche, not as neighbors, nor as allies, but as enemies. He remembered the fear in the eyes of villagers when raids swept through. He remembered the retaliation of soldiers, the screams, the burning lodges. He remembered the bitter cycle of vengeance, and his part in it. But he also remembered something else. There had been a boy once, small, no older than 10, who had run into the chaos as the soldiers burned a village. The boy had tried to shield his mother. The rancher, younger then, had seen it happen, and for the first time, the thrill of riding with armed men soured into shame. He had turned his horse aside, refusing to take part further, and from that moment something inside him shifted. He left that life behind soon after. He bought a patch of land far from the towns and their wars, and chose silence over stories. While others filled saloons with laughter or rage, he kept to himself. While others sought wives, he remained alone. He told no one why. But when he saw her standing on the block, head high, proud despite her bonds, the memory of that boy returned. Her defiance reminded him of a spirit unbroken, a flame he had once seen extinguished in another's eyes. And something inside him could not allow her to be thrown to the crowd. He had not stepped forward out of desire. He had not stepped forward to claim ownership. He had stepped forward because he knew what would happen if he didn't. The men in that town would have broken her, piece by piece, until her fire was gone, and he could not let another fire be smothered. Yet, as the road stretched ahead, he wondered what burden he had taken upon himself. She did not trust him. Why should she? To her, he was just another settler, another man who thought he could decide her fate. His silence, which he had always worn like armor, now worked against him. To her, his quiet might seem cold or calculating, when in truth, it was only the weight of words he had long left unspoken. The horse slowed as they approached a rise in the land. From the top, the rancher could see the faint outline of his property in the distance. Fences tracing the earth, the dark shapes of cattle grazing near the creek, and the small cabin that had been his only shelter for years. Would she see it as a prison? He wondered. Would she try to run the first chance she got? He didn't blame her if she did. He had bought her freedom from cruelty, but in doing so, he had chained himself to a burden he could not yet name. Perhaps it was redemption he sought, though he knew redemption could never be bought with one act. Perhaps it was atonement, a way to quiet the ghosts of his past. Or perhaps, deep down, it was simply a man's unwillingness to stand by when others were wronged. As the cabin grew closer, the rancher shifted slightly, tightening his grip on the reins. He could feel the tension in her still, the way her body leaned ever so slightly forward, like a runner waiting for the starting signal. She was ready to flee at the first chance. And maybe she should. But he hoped quietly that someday she would see his silence not as a shackle, but as something else, the only way he knew to carry the burden of his past. The stars lit the sky fully now, vast and unblinking, as they descended toward the ranch. Behind them, the town was nothing more than a memory. Ahead lay uncertain days, his solitude broken, his silence challenged, and her spirit unyielding as ever. The rancher knew one thing with certainty. Her presence had stirred the past he had long buried, and with it, the burden he carried would either find its peace or consume them both. The cabin sat quiet under the stars, a squat figure of timber against the rolling plains. Its small windows glowed faintly from a single lantern inside, the only sign of life in a vast wilderness. The Comanche woman sat tall on the horse, her eyes scanning the land as they approached, each detail etched sharply in her mind. The fences, the corral, the distant cattle moving like shadows. To her, it was not a home. It was territory she did not know, a place built by a man who had claimed her fate. The rancher dismounted first. He moved slowly, his boots crunching softly on the dry earth, and for the first time he dared a glance at her face. Her eyes were sharp, unwavering, filled with suspicion that pierced his silence. He held the reins steady, then extended a hand. To help her down, she did not take it. Sliding down herself, she landed lightly, almost soundlessly. Her posture remained tall, her chin high, as though she would not let him see even a flicker of weakness. He did not press her refusal. Instead, he led the horse to the corral, tying it securely, while she stood watching every move, as if calculating how far she could run and how quickly he could follow. Inside the cabin, the lantern's warm light flickered across rough-hewn walls. The rancher stepped in first, then stood aside, gesturing for her to enter. She hesitated at the threshold. For a heartbeat, she looked like a caged animal forced into an unfamiliar den. Yet she crossed it, her steps slow, her eyes darting to the corners. The cabin was simple, a single room divided by a low partition. One side held a cot, a small table, and a shelf with a few worn books. The other side was cluttered with tools, saddles, and gear. Everything bore the marks of a solitary life, functional but without softness. No woman's hand had touched this space. No laughter had warmed it. He cleared his throat softly, breaking the silence. "You can take the cot," he said, his voice gravelly, rarely used. She looked at him sharply, her expression unreadable. The cot was the only bed in the cabin. Where would he sleep? He turned and pulled an old blanket from a trunk. Without another word, he carried it to the corner, near the hearth. He spread it on the floorboards with a matter-of-fact air, as though this arrangement needed no explanation. Still, she kept her eyes on him, wary, unsure if it was some trick. But he did not meet her gaze again. He busied himself with the fire, coaxing the embers until the small room glowed with warmth. When the fire caught, he removed a small pot, filled it with water, and placed it on the flames. From a shelf, he brought down dried beans, jerky, and a scrap of salt pork. He worked, with quiet precision, as though cooking was as much ritual as necessity. The rich smell of stew began to spread through the cabin. Her stomach tightened at the scent. She had eaten little in the past days, but pride held her still, unmoving. Hunger was not enough to break the iron in her spine. When the food was done, he ladled stew into a bowl and set it on the table. Then he stepped back, retreating toward the fire, taking no portion for himself. She glanced at him, then at the bowl, suspicion clear in her eyes. "You need to eat," he said simply. She waited. Long moments passed in silence. The crackling, fire filled the space where words might have been. Finally, she moved to the table. She sat, but before touching the food, she murmured a prayer in her tongue, soft, musical syllables that the rancher could not understand but did not interrupt. Only then did she eat, each movement deliberate, her gaze flicking to him between bites. He remained by the fire, quiet, watchful, but not demanding. When she finished, he took the bowl without a word, washed it in the basin, and set it aside. The night stretched on. Wind rattled the cabin walls, carrying with it the howl of coyotes in the distance. The rancher lay on his blanket near the fire. His hat tipped over his eyes, though he was not truly asleep. The woman lay on the cot, but her body was tense, her hand curled as though ready to strike or flee. Sleep came to her in broken pieces, the weight of her new surroundings pressing heavily. She dreamed of home, of the wide plains where her people camped, of fires burning under the stars, of songs and laughter. But the dream fractured into the image of the auction block, the jeering crowd, the raised hand of the rancher. She woke with a start, her breath sharp. The lantern had burned out, leaving only the fire's dim glow. The rancher was still awake, his eyes open, watching the flames. He did not turn toward her, but he spoke, his voice low. "You're free here," he said. The words hung in the air, fragile, uncertain. She did not answer, but her chest tightened at them. Free? What did he mean? Could freedom be given or only taken? She turned her back to him and closed her eyes again, though sleep would not come easily. The morning sun broke over the plains with a harsh brilliance, turning the horizon into a blaze of gold. At the ranch, the world stirred to life. Cattle lowed in the distance, the wind carried the scent of dust and sage, and a hawk wheeled high, above. For the rancher, mornings were usually the same: work, quiet, solitude. But now every sound seemed sharper, every silence heavier. He was no longer alone. The Comanche woman rose before he did, her movements precise and silent. She stepped outside the cabin, barefoot on the cool earth, her gaze sweeping across the open land. The endless sky should have felt like freedom. But the fences hemming in the cattle reminded her that this was not her people's way. Every post driven into the ground seemed to cut into her spirit. The rancher watched from the doorway, his hat shading his eyes. He said nothing, only noting the way she stood tall against the wind, like someone who belonged to the land in ways he never could. He felt, for the first time, the weight of what it meant to bring her here, not just the challenge of trust, but the storm it might stir outside his ranch. By midday, he saddled a horse to ride into town for supplies. He hesitated, knowing what might await him there. Word traveled quickly in frontier towns, faster than the wind across the prairie. By now, the story of him raising his hand at the auction would have spread from saloon to stable, from trading post to church pew. People would talk, some with curiosity, others with scorn. She watched him prepare, her sharp eyes following every buckle and strap. She asked nothing aloud, but the question burned in her expression. Was he leaving her? "I'll be back before sundown," he said quietly, sensing her unease. He hesitated, then added, "You'll be safe here." Safe. The word sounded fragile, almost laughable, as though a fence and a cabin could hold off the world that judged her. Still, she did not reply. She only folded her arms and turned her face away, as if refusing to show him the fear or hope that churned inside her. When the rancher rode into town, the atmosphere was thick with scrutiny. Men leaned against posts outside the saloon, their conversations dropping into silence as he passed. Women standing near the mercantile pulled their children closer, whispering behind gloved hands. Every eye seemed to follow him, weighing, judging. Inside the general store, the usual clatter of trade quieted when he stepped through the door. The shopkeeper, a stout man with thinning hair, raised his brows but said nothing at first. He began gathering the supplies as requested: flour, coffee, ammunition. Yet his curiosity finally broke through. "Word is you brought that Comanche girl back to your place," the shopkeeper said, his tone cautious but edged with disapproval. The rancher gave a single nod. "She's under my care." "Under your care, eh?" The man's mouth twisted into something between a smirk and a frown. "That's a bold choice. Folks won't take kindly to it. Not after all the raids and blood. Spilled?" The rancher's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He paid for his goods in silence, shouldering the sack as if it weighed nothing. But as he stepped outside, he caught sight of two men muttering near the blacksmith's, their eyes cold and lingering on him. Trouble was brewing. Back at the ranch, the Comanche woman was restless. She had walked the perimeter of the land, testing the fence lines, noting every path that led away from the cabin. Her instincts urged her to flee, but something held her back. A thread she couldn't name. Perhaps it was the uncertainty of what lay beyond. Perhaps it was the memory of his quiet words by the fire. "You're free here." But freedom was a fragile thing, easily shattered. She knew the white townsfolk would not accept her, and her own people might see her as tainted, sold, lost. She stood between two worlds, belonging to neither. When the rancher returned, the weight of the town clung to him like dust. She sensed it immediately. The stiffness in his shoulders, the way his eyes scanned the horizon as though expecting riders to appear at any moment. "They know," she said softly, her first words to him in English since they had left the auction. Her voice was accented but clear, carrying the certainty of someone who had survived much. He met her gaze and gave a small nod. Yes, they know. Silence stretched between them, heavy with the unspoken truth. Both the town and her people would see this union as betrayal. That night, as the fire crackled low, distant sounds reached the cabin. Hoofbeats carried faintly on the wind, the echo of voices too far to make out. The rancher rose to his feet, his hand brushing the rifle near the door. The Comanche woman tensed, every muscle ready for flight or fight. But the sounds faded, swallowed by the night. Still, neither of them slept easily. The world outside was closing in, each side sharpening its knives, waiting for the moment to strike. Within the thin walls of the cabin, they sat in silence, two strangers bound by circumstance, their fates already marked by the storm rising on the frontier. The frontier had always been a place of dust and silence, but that night, the air carried a tension too sharp to ignore. A storm brewed, not of rain but of men and fury. For days, whispers in town had thickened like clouds on the horizon, and on the open prairie, shadows moved where no cattle grazed. The rancher and the Comanche woman felt it in their bones. The world would not leave them in peace. It began at dusk. The sky burned crimson as the sun sank and the first hoofbeats carried across the plains. The rancher stood at the doorway of his cabin, rifle in hand, his jaw set. She was beside him, her long hair catching the fading light, her eyes sharp as flint. They didn't speak. Words would have been wasted. By the time the riders appeared, the night had fully fallen. Lanterns swung in rough hands, casting wild light over angry faces. A dozen townsfolk rode forward, farmers, ranch hands, and men who thought themselves protectors of order. They stopped just short of the fence line, their leader, a broad-shouldered man with a scar down his cheek, lifting his voice to the cabin. "We won't stand for it," he barked. "Bringing her here, giving her place among us, after all the blood her people spilled? No. Either you send her out, or we'll come in." The rancher said nothing for a long moment. His silence stretched like a drawn bowstring. Then he stepped forward, voice calm but cutting through the night like steel. "She's under my roof. That makes her under my protection. You'll not touch her." A murmur rose among the riders. The scarred man spat into the dirt. "You'd risk your life for her? She's not one of us. She'll never be one of us." Behind the cabin, a second sound rose, the unmistakable beat of hooves, but coming from the opposite side of the land. The Comanche woman's eyes widened. She knew that rhythm, the cadence of riders who moved with the earth, not against it. Her people. The rancher felt it too, the land trembling under two forces converging. He turned to her, and in that moment, there was no mistrust between them, only an unspoken question. "Which side will you choose?" The Comanche riders emerged from the darkness like shadows come alive, painted faces, feathers catching moonlight, bows and rifles glinting. They stopped at the far edge of the pasture, silent but fierce. Their presence alone enough to make the townsfolk shift nervously in their saddles. An elder dismounted, his long braids streaked with gray. His voice carried. Across the land, deep and unyielding, "Daughter, we come for you. You do not belong here among those who would sell you like cattle. Come back. The blood of the Comanche runs in your veins." The woman's breath caught. Her people. Here. Yet the memory of the auction block, the humiliation, the chains, the silence of her tribe when she was taken, seared her heart. Slowly, she stepped forward until she stood between the rancher and the two groups, her small figure framed by the firelight spilling from the cabin. "Both of you would decide my fate," she said, her voice steady though her chest heaved. "But I'm not cattle. I am not a thing to be claimed by auction or by vengeance. I choose." Her words cut through the night sharper than any blade. The rancher's eyes softened, a flicker of something, respect, even awe, passing over his quiet face. The elder narrowed his gaze, but he did not interrupt. She turned to the townsfolk first. "You hate me because of my blood. Yet I have done nothing to you. You would see me dead, because it is easier than seeing me live free." Then she turned to her people, her voice breaking but strong. "You call me daughter, yet you let me be sold, cast away when it was not convenient to fight for me. If I return now, it is as a ghost, not as family." Finally, she looked back at the rancher, the man who had raised his hand not in conquest, but in defiance of silence. "And you did not speak many words, but you gave me shelter, food, a place to stand when the world wanted me to fall. You did not ask me to be less than I am." The prairie was silent. Even the horses seemed to hold their breath. "I choose to stay," she said, her voice carrying into the night. "Not as a possession, not as a bargain, as myself." For a moment, no one moved. The townsfolk shifted uneasily, their anger faltering under the weight of her words. The Comanche elder studied her long and hard, his face unreadable. Then, at last, he lifted his chin. "You are brave," he said, "and your path is your own. If this man honors you, then you are not lost." With a sharp gesture, he mounted his horse again, and one by one the riders melted back into the darkness.